Good afternoon, everybody. I have to say, hang on a second. No, they're going back out. It's a real honour to be here talking at Agile New Zealand. It was a great honour to be invited to put a speech forward. And actually, this presentation kind of came out of conversations that I'd had with a couple of different people. Ed, it was a conversation I had with Jim as well over the period. I'm not going to talk too much about NZDMe. Does anybody know what NZDMe is? That's what yep. So we actually are the Herald. We're the company behind the New Zealand Herald and Grab One and a whole host of radio sites. And that's the blurb done. Okay, gone. So, yeah, I'm going to be talking about Freerange Teams. And it's interesting, in some respects, it's quite nice being like almost the penultimate, one of the penultimate speakers of the event, because I can actually call out to a lot of what's gone on over the last 2 days as well. There's been a whole lot of conversation about teams. We just had a big one about leadership and teams. Sammy, who came in late, was noticed, talked about high-performing teams. I'm not talking about high-performance teams. I'm just talking about teams. Okay. But here are a bunch of synonyms that we use for teams. They have lots of different ways of describing it. Now, one of the things is that I personally feel that we're not very good at doing teams in the enterprise and the workplace, specifically the enterprise. And a little bit of that we saw a clue to downstairs with Ahmed's presentation, where he showed the old 3 pillars and the project manager, and we take a project manager and then we go, this person, this person, this person, this person, and you're on a project together. So we don't actually allow people to form teams. It's a little bit more like this. Does anybody understand what this is? Can anybody remember this when they were young at school? For some of you, you're probably like Sammy, were probably the first one picked every time. Got to have you on my team, got to have you on my team, because you're really good at this. And then there was, some of you would have been the person that was sat at the end kind of feeling glum every time because you never got picked. I wasn't going to call anybody out. But for me, and this is based a little bit on my own experiences, that what we actually do is we actually set ourselves up badly from a very early age in this respect, because we're engendering a pattern. So the person who's never picked, the reason he's never picked is because he never actually, or she, sorry, ladies, she never gets to actually run the team, take a major part or anything else. They're usually picked and then sidled off to the outfield. I remember this with cricket, because I hated cricket, and I just spent hours stood out on an outfield, and that's probably why I have a bad experience of this. But from my personal experience, and I don't know about anybody else, in this situation, it was usually the teacher who kept picking the same alphas to pick the teams, and kept picking the same ones. So we never got other children to actually experiment and find out if they were good at picking teams. And actually, it's a really useful skill, because you would be learning at an early age how to identify the very capabilities that you want from someone on your team to achieve your outcome. But if you don't get a turn at doing it, how do you actually engender that leadership? Coming back to what Ahmed was saying. So, yeah, the negatives are the same kid always at the end, the good kid always at the beginning, and we don't really get a chance to learn from it. Thinking back again to when you were at school, when you were in primary, you probably spent most of your primary years, do we call it primary here or junior? Primary. You're awake. It's the end of the day, and I'm thinking everyone's going to be wanting to get out the door as soon as they can. So you probably spent the entire primary period, unless you moved schools, in one class with one teacher generally. And you would do everything together as effectively a team. You would work together. It would be your class artwork on the wall, etc., etc. But then as we head up into high school, And can everyone think back to their transition from little primary up into a big centralized high school? And you would be stuck in a stream. You might have a form where you went to at the beginning of the day to say, here. And then you'd be off to your classes, and you'd just go to different classes throughout the day, and you wouldn't always be in the same class with the same people. You wouldn't really get to know people at the same level as you had done in primary. And I believe that that is actually how we then work in the workplace. If you think back to the project management example we had in the last session, you're constantly moving. You're never really coalescing into a team that actually works together. You're always off on different things. You're working in isolation from each other. And we can see this example in, has anybody been in or seen what's called a team, but where every single person in that team is working on something in total isolation, totally siloed from each other? A few hands going up, yeah. And did the people in that team actually know what the other people were doing? So you were in a team in name only. We had a team like this at NZDMe, and nobody could do any other person's job. So if there was an issue, nobody could actually log into that system and actually update someone's details or anything else, because that's what he does. And they very much siloed everything off. It's not actually in a very efficient way of working. But it's what we do, and I think a lot of it is because we've set these patterns up. So, and a lot of that comes back to, I'm sure you've all seen pictures of Ford's production line. It's commonly used at Agile conferences to show the difference between the factory system and modern work. Everyone seen that? How many people actually know the way that the school system is engineered is actually based on exactly the same? The school system is actually defined by the factory system that it was actually designed to produce children for. It's a process for moving children through the process to an outcome. So it's not really worried about a whole load of soft skills, it's worried about teaching them some things. Who came to Ed's presentation earlier? What did you think to that? Amazing, right. So Ed's presentation earlier on in the day was around using design thinking with a group of children at the school that his sons go to, and to do something totally different in respect of how those children actually engage with everything around them to actually learn. And a lady asked the question, is this just a buzzword? You know, why are we not doing this in the wider sense? But Ed had actually explained it, that the headmaster is all for it. There's 4 teachers in the school who are very resistant because it doesn't fit to what they were taught, to how to teach, because it's a process they run through. So where am I going with that? Essentially, we create those patterns earlier on when we're children. We hardwire ourselves to work in certain ways. And part of that is at high school, we're hardwired to be very all over the place, not working together as a team. Unless we're in a sports team. It's the only example I can find in our younger lives, sports or clubs. So if you're in the spelling bee, you probably would work together as a team. But sports clubs, sports teams are the only place where you will really come together to aim around a goal and efficiency. Otherwise, it's total individual. Oop. What did I do? So then we go to work. I don't know where that's, there it is. I know the workplace doesn't look like this anymore, but I thought it was quite fun. The interesting point is I can't work out if they're managers looking over everybody's shoulder or just some kind of inspectors. But when we go up to the workplace from school, we don't really get any training around teams. We're given a desk, we're given a laptop nowadays, and we're told how to get on with it. We're not really trained how to use a lot of that stuff. We're not really trained how to be part of a team. Because again, we're just going to be given some tasks and we go off and do them. So again, we repeat these silos. And as Ahmed said earlier, project management will come along. Project manager needs people. Now again, one of the things I found doing project management is you'll go to a department head, and you'll say, I need someone from your department to work on this project. How many people are here are department heads? If you were asked to supply, thank you. If you were asked to supply someone to a project, do you give the project your best person? Be honest. No. So the team straight away is undermined because you're not giving it the best person to give it because you need that person in your team. And they're probably the only person that can do the work that needs to be done. So we're constantly, in the workplace, we're constantly not pulling together around goals because we don't really have goals. We're all working in silos. Agile's a little bit different on that, as hopefully everybody's gathered over the last 2 days if you didn't know it already, because we have goals. We clearly set goals. They're to deliver something of value to our customers. Now, when I did my project management course, there was a lot of fuss about this. Has anybody seen this before? Yep. It's, and I've got to think of his name, Tuckman's Stages of Group Development. Can anybody, I've never seen a team that actually moves through this in a flow like it's represented here. And most of the time, this is exactly how it's represented online. You'll find a few different variations where it looks a little bit more like snakes and ladders. And that's closer to reality. But actually, a lot of people, when presented with this, when they're trained in management, MBAs, it's on the MBA course, project management, etc. When they're shown this, they're not really shown the context behind it. So they don't actually know that it's actually based on very weak research. And actually wasn't based on actually analyzing teams in a workplace. It was 26 teams in therapy. So it's kind of questionable. But we still take it. It came out in 1965. It was never revisited, and it's just in all the books. It's just taken for granted that this is how we form teams. Team forming is a continual activity, but it takes time. The team has to be together long enough to really get to know each other and really pull together. You can't really create a team for 2 weeks and then expect it to be a performing team. It doesn't really work like that. The other thing that I have an issue with this is that when we're teaching managers, etc., this kind of thing, why do we have to teach people this? Do we not know this? Have we become that unempathic that we don't actually know how to actually engage with people? That we actually have to be taught how people work? And I find that interesting that we feel that we need to teach people how to be people effectively. It's kind of what we're saying. So where does that come from? Where did we get those patterns of behavior that we're actually not pulling together and not actually communicating with each other very clearly, that someone actually had to sit down and come up with this? Again, could it be the industrialization of the way that we interact in the workplace? Because we were sat on chains, just pushing it along, because we're so process-orientated that we don't actually spend time communicating with each other in the workplace. And then when we found we needed to, someone actually had to figure out how we actually did that all over again. Now I remember this, 80s, 90s. It was a big thing in the UK, probably was here too. You were shoved off to the Brecon Beacons or some other enjoyable place where it rained a lot. And there was a theory that if you took people away for a weekend, you could make them a team. By handing, in this case, I think it's apples or something, but it might be water in the bucket. That doesn't make a team. That just is a bit of problem solving, okay? I went away on one of these weekends once. Do you know where we bonded and actually became a team? In the pub, after the event, moaning about the fact that we had to do it, and that we had to give a weekend up to do this, and, have another beer, mate. So, yeah, we're trying to fix a problem that we created in the first place. We had an old saying years ago when I worked at Unilever, was that we were constantly giving ourselves a headache to take a pill. And that's what that is. And usually, the team actually probably worked quite well together in the office. It was the manager that didn't. So, conversations over the last couple of months, and I've been doing a bit of soul searching and thinking about this problem. And partly because what I was asked to do at NZDMe was to take over and come in and pull 3 different, entirely different development teams together into one new team. And these teams were on different software stacks. They worked in very different ways. Some were slightly away along their Agile pathway. Some had never done anything to do with Agile. And they were spread across lots of different products with lots of different product owners. And so I had to fashion them into a team that actually pulls together. And some of what Ahmed said resonated with me because one of the things I did was pick out team leaders. I had some team leaders who were natural leaders themselves. They were great coaches. They were good at teaching their younger members of the team, the juniors, how to actually up their game. So I looked back through my earlier life for examples. And I doubt if anyone can spot me, but that's me, bottom left, second in. This was in Northern Ireland back in 1986. The Latin at the top actually means swift and bold, which is the motto of the Royal Green Jackets. Now, I was 17 and a half when I joined the army, and I'm not saying for a minute that you have to join the army to find out how to be part of a team. But the interesting thing is I joined a regiment that was actually right for me as an individual because of the way that the Green Jackets actually behave around the way they treat their junior soldiers. The Green Jackets have a motto that's basically thinking rifleman. They take every single rifleman, which is it means private essentially. They take every single rifleman that comes in and they teach them to think on their feet, hence the swift and bold. You're taught from day one that you are a thinking rifleman, you have a say, you have an input, etc. It's actually very democratic in some respects, in a lot of respects. Yeah, sure, we have chain of command. We have a corporal, then we have a sergeant, then we have a lieutenant. The lieutenant's the guy in the middle. He was quite a cool guy, actually. The sergeant's either side of him. And yes, typical soldiers, we liked taking photos like this. I think we did one every active and exercise and everything. But this is the only one I've got left, and I haven't actually seen this for over 20 years, till I dug it out the other day. But the thing is, for me, is that this is actually, not school. When I went here, this totally changed everything I knew, or thought I knew, about being part of a team. It actually taught me an awful lot of life skills as well. But essentially, what it taught me, in part, was that we were jointly responsible for everything we did. Now, if you consider, and this again, I say don't join the army to get this experience, we were actually responsible for each other's lives. So that means that as a team, we had to coalesce to a whole different way to we would ever do in the workplace, except maybe if you're mountain rescue or something along those lines, or a fireman. And in fact, that's why you'll find that servicemen and firemen and policemen have this empathy with each other, because they have that experience. So we have to learn how to actually work really well together really quickly. It helps that you spend 24 hours of the day in each other's company for like 4 months at a time, through some very stressful times, as you can imagine. But the essential nugget here is that in becoming a team, it was all about actually having a goal and actually everybody participating towards that goal. But it was years. I left the army and I kind of went, I'm not doing that anymore. And it was only years later, when I was actually running software development teams, that I began to revisit what I'd learned here. And I think Sammy mentioned this yesterday when you said about, you'd finished playing handball and you'd gone off and you'd gone into the corporate world, and then suddenly all of the lessons you learned started coming up again. Because it's about team management. And it's about the fact that this was a team. We didn't get split up. We didn't get sent all over the place. We were together for literally, I think I was in that company, in that platoon, in that section for 2 years. But we were constantly encouraged to innovate. One of the reasons why I liked being in the Green Jackets was because we actually were allowed to go out and buy our own equipment and all sorts of things, not our rifles. But everything else that we wore, because one of the other Green Jacket mottos was that any fool can be cold and wet. A wise man is comfortable and secure. And the point of that was you take care of yourself so that you're not a burden to the team, and in that way you assist the team to perform. The other one that I really love about efficiency was never stand when you can sit down, and never sit down when you can lay down. Which, if you think about it, means always do things in the right way so that, why are you giving yourself stress? And if you go back to making decisions in the presentation that Suzanne did earlier, we give ourselves a whole lot of stress instead of actually soaking it up as part of the team, thinking about those issues as a team and solving problems as a team. Thought I'd remove these. So, only a couple of you came to Ed's talk about education. Now, we home educated our children. And effectively, we went against absolutely everybody in the village we lived in the UK at the time. Everybody was aghast because most people actually tried to buy a house in that village to get their kids in that school. We had an issue with the headmaster and took our kids out. We took a leap into a total unknown experience. When my wife pulled the kids out, and then she rang me and said, I've taken the kids out of school. I'm like, what? Can we do that? It turns out we could, it was legal. But what it meant was that as a family, we changed our family dynamic totally. We were no longer like everybody else in our village. Everybody else in our village, mum and dad both worked. They dropped the kids off at school, they went away to work. Kids got picked up by a childminder at the end of the day if the parents didn't come home. That was their family dynamic. They only spent X amount of time with their children. They weren't responsible for their children's education. They'd got them into a great school, and that was the end of it. We had to take a totally different stance. Effectively, as a family, we had to become a team in a totally different way. We had to work out how to actually coexist with each other. Not so much me, because I escaped to work, but my wife and my boys, they had to work out how to live with each other in the house 24 hours a day. And for my wife, that meant not killing the little buggers at times. But these are two young children who had to learn how to operate as a team. They had to learn how to operate together, etc. It was a very different environment. But the thing is that what I've learned over the last 2 days that hadn't occurred to me when I was putting this presentation together is we created an environment of safety for every single member of the family. So we operated as a team with safety. We had rules, we had time out. We had all of those things that we put in place. We had little ceremonies. Strangely enough, we let our children not sit at the table and do schoolwork all day long. They were allowed to go off and experiment continually. I still think my oldest son, actually learned about gravity, magnetism, velocity, and something else from Thomas the Tank Engine. And then he made us take him we lived in Yorkshire, so we used to go to the National Railway Museum. So he learned about chemistry, he learned about physics from standing and watching a steam engine that had been cut in half and was still working. And he related that back to Thomas and everything that worked in Thomas's world. So he just learned naturally. And then they moved on to Lego. They actually learned how to read, mostly by having to read. My wife kept trying to teach them, and they kept resisting. And then they just did it, because it suited them. But that's the thing. We worked as a team to actually understand each other's, how we worked, rather than being managed from externally. That's the point of this. And yes, my wife really did try to teach them at the dinner table for a little while, but she gave up on that because it was just never going to work. But I particularly love this quote by Sir Walter Scott. And I think it resonates nicely with other things that have been said over the last two days. In an Agile team, it's all about you teaching yourself as well. It's all about taking ownership of what you need to know to do what you need to do, which goes back to my experience in the Green Jackets. It wasn't just about you being told everything. You weren't there to be told. You were there to think and do. While the boys were growing up, I somewhat foolishly volunteered to be a scout leader. And this was a little bit of an experience for me in terms of the difference between leadership and management. Now, bear in mind, in the Army, I had been an NCO. And you only got to be sent for NCO, which is leadership training, if you'd already been identified as someone who had the aptitude to be a leader. They didn't send anybody along, and it was a really hard course to do. And it didn't really teach you an awful lot about leadership. It taught you about all the skills of looking after people and actually being able to make decisions. And the leadership was slightly lower down the tree. That was the soft skill that the Army wasn't so fussed about. But in Scouts, what I discovered was, with my experience of the Army and experience of home educating, I adopted a slightly different way of working here, was that I actually took the view that I was only there to help the Scouts, not to be a Scout leader. So I was there to let them decide what they wanted to do. They were Scouts. You know, if you go back to Baden-Powell's original reasoning for inventing the Scouts, it was to let young men and women, interestingly enough, Girl Guides was never a Baden-Powell invention. It was his sister, I think. And that was actually a reaction to Victorian England not thinking that girls should do things that boys did. But Scouts, the original concept was for young men to learn the skills to actually let them become leaders. So that was what I set about doing. But the revelation to me was that we went away. Turns out I was actually the Scrum Master, effectively. I was there to remove obstacles to let them actually self-organize themselves. They had total autonomy on how they run. I was just there to help them. But we went away on a canoeing weekend with all of the local scout groups in Yorkshire. And my scouts were they came up to me afterwards, they were shocked at the way all the other troops were treated. They just couldn't believe it, that all these other troops were just managed, constantly managed. They were browbeaten. They were constantly pushed down. There was a famous quote from them that they kept using in a derisory term. One of the scout leaders had this thing of, he would say, hands up, shut up, constantly if he wanted to speak. And my scouts were like, why? All he has to say is, quiet please guys, can I talk? But it was a different approach. Again, I wanted them to be a team. I didn't want to manage them from external. I wanted them to learn how to work together as a team. So I gave them the opportunity and the skills to do so. But what I find in the workplace is all too often we're still managing externally. We still have a manager who says how to do things and controls. And then needs to be taught Tuckman's stages of group development, because they don't actually understand it. They don't actually have that leadership capability to actually understand what a leader means. And in PMI, the PMI qualification I did, there was nothing about actually the soft skills of being a leader. And should project managers be a manager or the project leader? There's a debate that's still going on inside PMI. Now, why am I showing you these examples? It's not to say just this is my life, this is what happened to me. I actually want you to kind of look at all of the engagement you've had with teams outside of work, to look for examples of performing teams. And it's very similar, as it turns out, and Sammy and I had never seen each other's presentations, but it's very similar in that context. Sammy uses sport as her vector for doing this. There are lots of different ways that we engage with teams outside of work. But that's what I think we fundamentally lost. And I think it goes back to school, was we made a separation between how we perform at work and how we perform in things we enjoy. I'm not saying some people didn't enjoy school, but I think you get my gist. And just to kind of put that point home, this is the NZDMe blacks lacrosse girls team for next year. And they're coached by a friend of mine, Kari Jones. And Kari's interesting because she's actually been coaching lacrosse since she was a teenager. And she told me recently that she'd always considered herself, and her peers have always considered herself to be a great coach. Back in March, NZDMe started on a new project to create a data lake. We were going to invest in unstructured data. We were going to invest in our audience data. We had a lot of questions to solve. We had a whole load of experiments to do. Because we had lots of data from 3 companies that had come together, and we didn't know how that data would go together. We didn't even know what questions we needed to ask of that data to find out the answers. We decided this has to be an Agile project. We have to have experimentation ongoing all the way through it. Kari had never been involved in an Agile project in her life. She was effectively going to be the product owner. We gave her a Scrum Master. We gave her some suitable people to work with. Kari recently said to me that learning Agile was a game changer for her. She actually went back to this team and actually pulled herself out of them slightly. She actually went back, she removed herself from being a coach who told them all exactly what to do, and she started giving them autonomy. She started letting them make decisions about their training. She started letting them actually come up with ideas about how they wanted to play a match. And she was amazed and absolutely thrilled the fact that the girls went with it. They just grabbed it and ran. Going back to the scouts, they were allowed, they were encouraged to take ownership. Going back to when I was in the military, we were encouraged to take ownership. The military stance was, quite simply, and this is quite brutal, that every single member of a squad has to be able to take charge when the person who's currently in charge dies. It was brutal. But essentially, she gave them more freedom to be a team. She was still accountable, going back to what Armand was just saying. She was the accountable person. She was the coach. But they now were dictating how they trained, when they trained, what they prepared for, everything. They took ownership far more of their sport and activity. For me, that makes a team because they had the goal, they had it. Not Kari the coach, they had the goal. They were all going for it. But it was Agile that helped Kari actually take that on board and learn that lesson. I'm going to run. So, hopefully some of you have seen this before. If you haven't, I'm going to tell Dave. So this is from scrum.org. This is from their revised Scrum values. And why am I putting that up there? It's Scrum. I'm talking about teams. Well, actually, if you remove the word Scrum from this little poster, everything works for a team in any way that you're working. Doesn't matter if you're not doing Scrum, these values work across the board. But for me, particularly, the most important value on this poster is respect. If I go back to, as a family unit, we had to respect each other and our space and our viewpoint. And we still do. We have raging arguments, but we respect each other's viewpoint. If I go back to the scouts, I respected them, and that was how I treated them. And they respected me back, and they treated each other with respect. But then we went to that canoeing event, and the other scoutmasters didn't treat their scouts with respect. And it wasn't there in return. So for me, the most important of these values is respect. If you have respect for people, the rest of it will fall into line. It will come, especially if it's mutual respect. And that, to me, is the foundation of what makes a team. Because you respect each other, you're going after a shared goal. If I was to say the second one, I would actually say it's courage. Because it's courage that helps you tell the other team members that, no, I don't think we should do that. I'm sure you may have a friend, or you've heard the saying about a friend is the person who tells you you look stupid in that outfit, because they know that you will go out and embarrass yourself. A friend is the person who tells you you've had enough drinks. And that takes courage. That's true friendship. But in a team, it's the same thing. It takes courage to be the person who stands up and says, no, we should not do this. We need to rethink this. It's too easy to just go, okay, yeah. But it takes courage to stand up for it. But one of the things I also like about this is it's very simple. And I think sometimes that in organizations, we try to make it too complex. Going back to management courses, MBAs, etc. You know, they'll throw up Tuckmans, they'll throw up all sorts of graphs, etc. They'll throw up lovely quadrants. I love quadrants. And essentially, we're just adding layers and layers and layers to stuff that actually, if we think about it, if we go back and look at teams that we've been involved in, we know this stuff. We're actually quite often, we may actually be very good at it, but we don't really know it because this stuff gets in the way. A lot of the time, it's just noise that we need to deal with. And if you look back at the things I've been involved in, maybe you'll understand why Agile works for me. It makes sense to me. And a lot of that is the first line of the Agile Manifesto. It's individuals and interactions over process and tools. So I believe wholeheartedly that teams are the cornerstone of Agile. Forget whether you're doing Scrum, forget whether you're doing XP, SAFe, LESS, anything else. If you can actually get the team dynamic, the team to work right, and give the team the opportunity to meld and form as a team, the rest of it will start to come into place. I use it too often probably, but I have a firm belief that if I get the people right, everything else takes care of itself. If I hire the right people, if I put the right people together, if I help those people select the right people, everything else works. So when I am hiring, actually, I never hire in isolation. The team actually hire. If I'm hiring someone to go into a team, that entire team meet the people that we're looking at hiring before we actually make the decision. Because they will all have slightly different views on that person. It takes time, but actually, at the end of it, it's a perfect fit. It's a really good fit, and they're flying. Working at NZDMe is great in some respects because I've actually found a company that actually puts people at the center of its values, in its mission and everything else. We have 3 values at NZDMe. We're supposed to be connected, individuals and interactions. We're supposed to be curious, courageous as well. And we're supposed to be confident. They actually want us to say, no, stop, we shouldn't be doing this. Which is, I think, is really neat that a company's actually put that in its core values. It's actually encouraging teams. And yes, it's the Scrum framework, and we've all seen it before. But again, this goes back to why I like Agile, why Agile works for me, and why I think that teams are so important to Agile, based on all the experiences I had coming up to the last 12 years when I started working in software development. And actually, I started reading about Agile back in the 90s. XP was in the magazines. I read PC Pro at the time. And they talked about it a lot, extreme programming, etc. And it made sense to me then. But I wasn't in an area where I actually had an opportunity to do anything with it. I was working in health and safety in Unilever. I wasn't actually working in software development. I was working with technology a lot, but not with software development. So it just made sense. But again, my point is, it only makes sense if the team takes total ownership. Yeah, you can have someone who's accountable, and at NZDMe, every one of my teams has a team lead that's a senior developer. But I also have practice leads. And they are accountable for the way that we do things. But ultimately, I'm accountable for every single thing that my team does. I'm the neck, as Ahmed put it. And I take that role, that's glad. That comes with the territory. That's what I'm there for. I'm there to remove. I'm still, in some respects, I'm actually still a Scrum Master. In fact, I grew a beard last year, and they nicknamed me Scrum Papa. It was grey. I only grow grey now. But that's my point, is that I firmly believe, and I hopefully some of you will go away and think about this, is that if you can get the team right in the middle there, all of the process, all of the tools, everything else will start coming together. But if you just constantly try to shove people in, so like round pegs into a square hole, it's not going to come together in the same way. So when I prepared this presentation, one of the things I was mindful of is a lot of conferences that I've been to, and same at Agile, is there's a lot of talk about people and this is how we do it. And I'm always worried that people go away and actually then just try to copy that. They try to make that fit. In the same way that I've come across Scrum Masters who are very particular about how we do Scrum. Instead of actually letting the team actually define how it does Scrum, or even if Scrum's right for the team. Because it's not letting them they're not letting them take ownership of the process. I came across this quote, which I really like. Sadly, Richard Hackman has passed away. He said that, "I have no question that a team can generate magic, but don't count on it." What he actually goes on to say, and excuse me while I read this, "A good team will satisfy its internal or external customers, become stronger as a unit as time passes, and foster the learning and growth of its individual members. But even the best leader on the planet can't make a team do well. All anyone can do is increase the likelihood that a team will be great. And the leader still will have no guarantees that she will create a magical team." And this is a bit I like. "Teams create their own realities and control their own destinies to a greater extent and far sooner in their existence than most team leaders realize." So what he's essentially saying is you can't manage it. You can't control it to the level that some people think you can. You can't micromanage them to that point, because actually you're just getting in the way. If you let them actually become a team, then they have the opportunity to actually really become magic. He did write a book, but I can't remember what it's called. So this presentation for me was a placeholder. This is my user story, if you like. What I wanted from this was to put some ideas in people's heads, to put some thoughts forward, to put my experiences forward, and get people to actually go away and start thinking about it maybe a little bit afresh. To go out there and actually look at examples of good teams that you've been part of, and look at those teams and then look at where you are in the workplace, and does that work? Is that right? Does that resonate? Can we do that in the workplace? If you're doing it now, absolutely fantastic. But can we actually build a team around a goal, and that team really forms and really pulls itself together because it's united in wanting to achieve a fantastic outcome? As I say, I get out of the way and let my team actually deliver value for themselves and my company. And that's taken a lot of explaining to certain people in our organization, because while we may have those values, we still have people that don't really internalize it. They don't really get it. They're still trying to manage. And they don't quite understand that I don't want to manage the team, I want to lead them. But I want to lead them in a way that lets them become a team and lead themselves. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to disagree with me. I really just want you to go away and think about it for yourselves. Talk about it, come up and talk to me, whichever way you want to do it. But I want people to have the conversations. I think it's time we really started looking at this and thinking about this in a new light.
Andrew.
Thank you.